These guys have lived with me before and heard me ranting plenty. So this will just be like hanging around at our house at midnight and talking about bullshit. Why is everybody here? Why are you here? Does anybody have any particular reason you're here? What do you want to know? What do you want to know?
The description sounded really interesting.
Scientific inquiry.
Cool, okay.
I thought that you were going to flip it the other way. I thought that you were going to be one of the thing that you say you don't like. I thought it was going to be that.
You were here to challenge me.
I wasn't here to challenge you. I was here to see what your evidence was.
Yeah. Well, my evidence was prepared in the last 15 minutes here. But it's surprising what you can find online when you very quickly just do searches for things like low frame rate comparison. And this is kind of where I'll start, because this, I feel like, is the biggest one, is frame rate. Gamers get in arguments about frame rate. Oh my God, the PC master race versus consoles, etc. Yeah, the overscan's fucked up, but you can look a little to the left. Oh, I see.
I don't want to do shit.
You just decrease the size of your browser.
No,
That's fine. We can see what we're doing. Leave it alone. So, all right, what's there is a 15 frames per second bouncing box. And even in this viewing environment, I think everybody can agree that that looks a little choppy. You can see it looking a little choppy.
Just a show of hands, anybody here who doesn't know what frames per second means? Raise your hand, please.
Okay, cool.
Okay, cool.
That's good. We're not dealing on a completely uneducated level here. Yeah. So I've been doing animation for a long time, and I mean, I started out doing like stop motion animation on 8mm film, and 8mm film, like your standard 8mm film camera, runs at I think 18 frames a second, which is sort of an odd low number, but in all my various experimentations and everything, I've found that there are a couple of magic numbers on the scale. As the frame rates go up, you run into these magic numbers where it appears different and things happen a little bit differently, and they're not precise. You cannot say that like at 12 frames per second this phenomenon happens, but in the zone of like 10 to 15 frames per second things will happen. And basically there's a magic number somewhere around 7 or 8 frames per second where you will start to perceive it as motion, and it'll look kind of like this. It looks like choppy as hell motion, but that's basically the level where, like, if you draw a little stick figure guy beating somebody up in the corner of your book and then you do the flip book thing, you're dealing with, like, down under 10 frames per second, but you perceive it as motion, just really choppy motion. And basically what happens is, as you double from there, every doubling of frame rate sort of hits another magic number where your perception is suddenly different. And I don't have a 5 frames per second example or anything, but somewhere in the like.
Actually, do it the other.
Well, yeah, okay, I can. I'll try and get that up in a moment, but somewhere in the like 15 frames per second zone, like this, you start losing the individual frames and really perceive it more as choppy motion, like this. And then somewhere in the zone of 30 frames per second, you stop perceiving the chop, really. Like, unless you're looking for it, and that's like another point that I'll just keep bouncing back to over and over and over. It depends very, very much on what you're looking at. If you see a video of me sitting here talking, the frame rate that'll be acceptable for that is very, very wildly different than the frame rate that will be acceptable for like a Michael Bay movie jumping around with everybody like, bullets flying and lasers and sparks and shit. Like, if there's a lot of stuff going on, obviously, you need more frames to represent it properly. And your brain will just sort of fill in the gaps. And basically, it's very dependent on what you're dealing with, and you have best and worst case scenarios for everything. So, a lot of people cite the frame rate of film. Movies run at 24 frames per second. For anybody who doesn't know, Your standard film is 24 frames per second. Video in this country is 30 frames per second. But that's actually it's actually 60 fields per second where it draws in half of the frame, and I'll get into interlacing later because it's a nightmare. So we've got 30 frames per second here, and then 60 here. And this is properly representing the 60. There's a little bit of tearing because my VSync isn't perfect or anything, but you can definitely see, when you sort of do an A-B comparison, you can see the chop in that. If you're just looking at it going up and down, you can see it sort of jitter a little. And then with this one, the chop is significantly lessened. And what's up with the sort of magic number that's around 30 frames per second is it's basically the point where, under most circumstances, you don't see nasty chop. Like, it just doesn't jump out to your conscious brain, and it sort of starts becoming an unconscious thing. The reason film runs at 24 frames per second is because film is expensive. So you want to use as little of it as possible. So, like 80 years ago, or whenever it was that they invented the standard, they figured out how low they could go and still have it be decent. And basically the magic number that they agreed on was 24 frames a second. If you go any lower than that, there are way too many circumstances where it just looks choppy. And now, because film is 24 frames per second, and because film is art, and people regard the great art of the classic films of Scorsese and yada yada, whatever, it's the most beautiful thing they've ever seen. Therefore, 24 frames per second is perfect. You have no idea how many arguments I've had with this, with people in the visual effects world about this. That film look means it has to be shitty.
So let me jump in a little bit here. One of the interesting things about your visual recognition system is that it is all about bandwidth. How much information are you pulling in? Now, one way, if you think back about, how many frames per second do I want? Usually you adjust the graphics quality about how many visual effects do you have the graphics settings on high, low, and also the resolution. How many pixels do you have? So let's move over to the adaptive frames render quick. Now, there's a little area of graphics research that is looking at the bandwidth of the graphics processor. So the graphics processor can basically, this is a very high-level abstraction and glossing over things, but can only put forward so many pixels per second, can update and render them. So which pixels are you going to choose to update, and how frequently? Well, one way is you can go the temporally detailed, you can go the spatially detailed, or you can do some of these adaptive frameless rendering. Now, temporally detailed means you're going to drop the resolution. You want high frames per second, but few pixels. Spatially detailed is we're going to max out the frames, the quality of the frame, but we're going to have a very choppy, very low frames per second. And the adaptive frameless rendering and the different types of frameless rendering, you don't have frames per second. You have an amount of bandwidth you're shoving through the graphics processor to update the individual pixels, so how do you choose what to do? And in the bottom, so the top left you'll see the low resolution, top right you'll see the low frame rate, bottom left you'll see the traditional frameless rendering, and the bottom right you'll see some of the, it's kind of an old advance now, it's about 9 years old, but this is the best video I can find to show you the different techniques that are being worked on to render based on bandwidth and what you can see. So look particularly for the visual artifacts along the edges. It's working to update what will jump out at you the most.
Here we show all three rendering strategies along with our new adaptive frameless approach.
Now note that all of these are using the same amount of GPU power, the same amount of processing to create all four of these.
See, at the top, we've got high resolution and high frame rate. And then the bottom is their different techniques for adaptively working with, either high resolution or high frame rate in the same video.
And if you look at the different MPEG compressions, the different video compressions and codecs used today, they tend to focus more towards the adaptive frameless rendering techniques because they're trying to figure out what will the human eye actually perceive, and then let's put the bandwidth for your video towards what will impact the visualization the most.
So, yeah, I mean, that's, just this video right here is fascinating to me. It's the same amount of information on the top, but, you know, high res versus high frame rate.
I feel like we just jumped from A to Z a little bit.
Yeah,
Like,
well,
hey,
he
by
does
the way,
that,
there's this
yeah.
frame rate thing, and
Yeah.
here's the technology that you're going to see 10 years from now.
Yeah.
In order to,
Yeah. What we're talking about is it has to do with bandwidth, and think about it that way. Like, how much information are your eyes receiving, and where's it being put?
I saw a hand go up.
Yeah, I was just curious as to the, how much GPU power does that really cost? The bottom right one, the adaptive frames.
It's still basically working on research labs because there's a lot of caveats that don't work well with games yet, but it's an active area. So it's for certain types of problems you can do it very well, but other types of problems, other types of visual effects, it doesn't work so well.
So one of the reasons that I'm really interested in this stuff, and I think you're going to see this a lot more being talked about with gaming, is I mean, everybody's probably familiar with the Oculus Rift and all the virtual reality research that's going on right now. Video games provide, Paul's talked some about film, video games provide an interesting, much more challenging use case for frames per second, particularly like in first-person type games where you're not just updating, you're not just looking at one subject on a screen talking. Every frame when you're moving around and aiming and things like that, and even more so with virtual reality where your head is constantly in motion, no matter how still you try to hold it, it's moving from the blood pumping through the muscles in your neck. Every single frame, every single pixel of the screen has to move constantly. So when you have the entire image being updated in front of you all the time, if that's updating slowly, I mean, aside from you just have less information to react on, like if it's a fast-paced game, it can also make you very, can be disorienting, make you nauseous and stuff like that. And in virtual reality, where, like you saw with the difference, when you went from 15 to 30 frames per second, 30 frames per second looked amazing. Like, it's like, wow, that is so super smooth, and you can almost not imagine anything smoother than that. Then when you go from 30 to 60, suddenly 60 looks like amazingly, magically, perfectly smooth, and you couldn't imagine anything being more smooth than that. But as you start doubling up from, beyond that, you do get some perceptive, like, minimizing gains as you keep going and going, but that can really be the difference between an image that looks smooth and that fools your brain into thinking that you're actually somewhere that you're not. And that line in virtual reality, they're finding like the very, very minimum for that is like 90 hertz. And optimally they want to get up to, 120 is kind of the magic number for you could still see the difference probably between 120 and 240, but 120 is that kind of magic number of like, hey, I'm there, I'm in this place. And below that, your brain is still kind of holding back a little bit.
Yeah, and he's hitting again on what I was saying, we're going to keep bouncing back to, is it depends very much on the use case. Depends very, very much on whether you're sitting back and watching The Godfather or you're running around in a virtual environment and paying attention to everything and like intently looking for information in the scene. When you're playing a first-person shooter, you're looking for enemies. You see 10 pixels of an enemy and your brain twitches to go aim at that, see if it's a threat and shoot the right gun at it.
One thing that jumps out a lot is when you get artifacts, like those little pixels, the one pixel that looks wrong, that one that jumps out at you. There's a lot of algorithms that are used for anti-aliasing, and that's the jaggies that you see, especially with lower resolution, and it tries to blur those lines. Really, I want to step back. In signal processing, there's this notion called the Nyquist sampling. Yes. And the Nyquist sampling theorem basically states that if you have a signal coming in, if you have something that measures a signal, it can be an eye, it can be an ear, it can be a microphone, doesn't matter. You need, and you expect a signal at a certain rate, like let's say that I'm speaking at a certain frequency. You have to sample, that means you have to take an input at least twice the rate that you want to measure at in order to properly get it. And there's some nice ways you can look at it.
I'm just looking for stuff here to see if we have any nice, visual aids.
Yeah, so if you think about it in terms of like some sort of a wave, like a sine wave, and you want to catch what is the frequency of that sine wave, you have to sample within it, at least double that rate. Now take that to anti-aliasing. Think about a game you've played where it really has bad aliasing. It's got a lot of jaggies. You have anti-aliasing turned off, and you can use the cheap ways. Most graphic cards support various types of anti-aliasing techniques which sort of smooth that out, but there's still some aliasing. You've probably seen some fence in the background or some sort of, maybe a chain link fence doesn't look quite right. Well, the best way to do it is to use super sampling, which means you double the resolution in both dimensions. So you have 4 times the number of pixels. And then you downsample it, and you interpolate between the two. That is the best way. That is the perfect way of anti-aliasing. But it's very costly because you need to put forth 4 times the amount of pixel throughput.
Oversampling, basically.
Yeah, oversampling.
So I guess where he's kind of getting is that, well, it sort of also applies to temporal.
Right. Well, yeah. And this is a fun thing for anybody who hasn't spent forever thinking about it. Motion blur is temporal anti-aliasing. Like, anyway, all right,
So-
yo.
So is there, when we talk about the fact that, you want higher frame rate, let's say for a video game or whatever, but, you need different frame rates for different situations.
Yeah.
So is there anything inherently wrong with 24 frames per second for film? I mean, if Scorsese's
The thing is, there's,
talking,
right, and the thing with film is it's a 100-year-old medium now, and the language of film, the way people are lit, the way shots are composed, everything has been building for 100 years. And anybody who's a good director of photography, a good cameraman, a good director, knows how to work in that context. And a lot of it is just sort of intuitive now, because they grew up watching film after film after film. They're just sort of imitating what worked. And a lot of it was just sort of experimentation over the decades. People were doing things, and some things look beautiful, and some things just look like crap. And so the language of film has evolved to include a lot of compensation for the limitations of the medium. And the one really huge, simple thing that is just the biggest factor there is film cameras are gigantic, heavy, 80-pound things that need to be mounted on giant gimbals and stuff. They don't move fast. So you just don't get the handheld, Blair Witch shaky cam on an old film camera. So that goes a long way to preventing a lot of the problems that come with low frame rate. If the camera is very stable and it's never doing this, and you're not getting like a global jitter of the entire scene, then your frame rate, if nothing's moving, your frame rate goes down to 0, and it's fine. So basically the less things are moving, the less frame rate you need, and that has become a part of the language of film and the look of film. So that's basically what's up with that, but the answer to your question is there is no answer. It's just like, frame rates are frame rates, there's best cases and worst cases, and personally, I can't watch Michael Bay movies because they just look like choppy hell to me.
so, to kind of follow up then, what do you say to these people who say that movies should move to 48, all that should move to 48?
They're assholes.
All right.
I'm right here, guys.
No, I honestly, just on the 48 frames per second film thing, I'm totally into more frame rate. It's fantastic that they're pushing it. It's a terrible tragedy that the flagship was The Hobbit, because they spent a bajillion space bucks and many, many years and like all of New Zealand to establish this like beautiful storybooky, fantasy, soft look of Lord of the Rings. And then they go over to The Hobbit and they're trying to do the same look with this like hyper amplified technical ability, and all of a sudden everything looks way too crisp and it just looks wrong. The movie to do it with would have been Tron.
Yes.
Okay, what's up?
This is why the ultra high def demo videos they have in like Best Buy and Walmart always look a little bit off.
That's because anything in Best Buy and Walmart always looks a little bit off. Those people just don't know how to set up anything. That's honestly that.
There's also an interesting thing about that, because a lot of TVs now will do.
They're going up to like 240 hertz
Right,
with their interpolation.
but the source signal is still basically a 24 hertz signal.
Yeah.
So they're actually, they're dynamically generating frames in between, which creates artifacting and stuff like that. Some of it is also subjective, because like your entire time growing up, you found that like things that look good are in 24 frames per second. They look good because they had big budgets and good cameras and things like that. And then like soap operas were all filmed in 60 frames per second because they're on video, which is 60 fields. So
And it's an
then you see
association
something-
thing.
Yeah,
at
you
that
see
point.
something
It is
moving like
just an
that.
association thing.
30 frames per second, 60 fields.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm gonna skip interlacing.
Just call it
Fuck
60.
If anybody wants to know about interlacing, look it up because it's obsolete and it sucks. But
well,
over here,
and-
she has a question.
Yeah, can you explain artifacting in more detail? You glanced over it a little bit. If you want.
Well, I can.
Can you repeat the question?
She asked to explain artifacting in more detail, and artifacting is just a general term that refers to any unwanted visual phenomena. When you have when you have a video signal or whatever, there's artifacting in audio, etc. It just refers to.
I was just going to say, a really simple way of imagining it is if you picture a perfectly smooth sine wave, and then say you could only sample that sine wave at 8 times per cycle, and then you drew a line with those between those samples, you wouldn't have a smooth curve, right? You'd have like a stair-stepping pattern. Well, what you're actually getting is extra data. You're not losing data by getting the stair step sort of implies that you're adding data that wasn't there at a higher frequency. So basically you get these edge sort of sounds. Either if it's in audio, you get some higher frequency ringing. If it's in video, you'll get extra noise and pixels or blockiness and stuff like that. If you see a really bad JPEG image, like really badly compressed JPEG image on the internet, and you see the little kind of...
Well, and there's a good image for it right here.
It needs more JPEGs.
Let's take a step back from what is an artifact? Well, an artifact is, let's go back even above that to what is in the human mind. How does the human mind perceive visual images? And
Just get too meta.
yeah, so we have all these different different chunks in our brain, these different groups of neurons that look for different specific things. There's a great experiment done, I forget, some number of years ago with cats. They raised cats in an environment where they didn't show them any horizontal or vertical lines. They like the specific cat, they just no vertical lines. And after they spent a couple of years in that, their first couple of years of their life, they could not even perceive any horizontal lines. And from some of the more recent research, we found that your visual cortex has all these different super individualized, specialized chunks of it to look for specific things. You have something for circles, for different types of shapes. So there's still a lot of questions. We don't know a lot about what all those pieces are, but your mind, your eye gets all this information and it's cached. It does all these sort of things to interpolate, which we'll hopefully have time for to talk about. And then it goes to
This panel's about 5 hours long.
yeah, it goes to the next layer, which starts pulling out all these artifacts and says, I see a circle in this part of it, I see this. And then even the facial recognition is in a different part of your brain than your visual cortex. That's actually kind of down here. And there's people who have disorders who cannot recognize faces, and this is a very well-studied thing. So all these different parts of the brain are lighting up. And an artifact is really something that stands out, that activates a different part of your brain, a different one of those circuits or groups of neurons that it shouldn't have activated. That's why those jaggies stand out.
All right, so he just took it to the neurological level here. I just want to point out that the image that's sitting here right now is a great visual aid for explanation. This is basically an explanation of aliasing. And on the left, we've got lower resolution. On the right, it's higher resolution. So you look at the diagonal lines. The stair-steppiness on the left side is an artifact of the lower resolution. And when we refer to artifacts, it is just those things. There are artifacts of compression, of frame rate, of color rendering, etc. They're just basically unwanted parts of the signal that show up because we don't have the capability to just magically duplicate everything.
And so the question becomes, how do we hide these artifacts? What sorts of algorithms do we apply so that we don't perceive those? And the image scaling, which most new TVs, pretty much all new TVs do, they do it temporally, they do it spatially, is come up with ways to fill in the gaps. Let's say that that's our input, the one on the left, with all of that aliasing. That's all the data we have. well, can we interpret the smiley face, the circle, or the waves, instead of saying that, well, we have this point, this point, this point, can we interpret that as a curve? And there's a bunch of different algorithms to do that and try to fill it in. Sometimes they work very well. It's trying to figure out where are the lines, where are the curves in the image, but sometimes you can get minor artifacts with that. So this is the type of, you can look up and down here a little bit.
Real quick, I just want to point out that with that image, and you can see it on this image too, I lied to you. It's actually backwards. The one on the left is the original. The one on the right is an interpolation of the original. So all the curves that you're seeing are actually artifacts. But it's designed to make it look nicer.
And to hide the artifacts and to fill in the gaps that your brain won't fill in.
So there's a lot of weird sort of like stuff going on here where like it ends up being about aesthetics. It's like if anybody remembers back in the day when the PlayStation and Saturn were the hot consoles and then the N64 came out and everybody complained about how the N64 was blurry because the N64 was interpolating the textures and the PlayStation and Saturn were not. So the textures were incredibly low res and there was nothing you could do about it because the technology back then had about 4 pixels of memory in it and you couldn't really do anything there.
12 pixels.
But you could, depending on what you did with that information, you would end up with either blocky or blurry pixels and there was console wars about which one is better. And basically it's just, you have very little information to work with, how do you represent it? And a lot of the artifacts that we talk about come from those sorts of challenges. Okay, I want to sort of finish the frame rate topic so we can shut up about that and move on. The point there, as the magic numbers go up, and I showed you guys frame rate stuff, and this is another minor sidetrack but general overriding phenomenon here. When you start running into an issue where your hardware cannot represent what you're working with, which we have here with this guy, all right? I can adjust how that moon moves. That's 5 frames per second, looks like shit, doesn't look like motion. 10 frames per second, it's motion blurring a little bit, it's cool. Like, it sort of starts to look like motion, but choppy as hell. There, we're starting to get into a good zone. Now 30 frames per second is what you're used to. 60 frames per second, you can kind of notice, it looks a little nicer. 120 frames per second.
Better hardware.
Exactly. So if you don't know what you're doing and you're just kind of screwing around here and pushing the button, you push this 120 frames per second button, if it didn't give you that warning, you'd be like, oh, that's 120 frames per second. I don't see any difference. Because there is none. The screen can't put it out. It's putting out 60.
Does that result in more chop? Because I use 140 frames monitor.
It can result in artifacting depending on the system, but no, like
What's artifact?
your dick. There's an audio corollary on this one where there's tests you can find online that'll test the upper ranges of your hearing, and it'll play higher and higher tones until it goes away. And human hearing range goes up to around 20 kilohertz. As you get older, it drops. Anybody who's old enough to have an old CRT, like standard def that they lived with, you can hear that tube even when it's off. That sound the tube is making is somewhere around 15 kilohertz. Once you're past about 25 to 30 years old, you just can't hear that anymore. Your eardrums harden up a little bit or whatever, and you don't get that. I'll finish what I'm talking about the audio here. There's tests online where you can click the button and test your audio. Problem is, most computer audio systems do not render the highest ranges of audio correctly. So you can push the button and it'll be like, I'm now putting out a 15 kilohertz tone, and you'll be like, oh, well, I hear that. No, you don't. You hear a harmonic that was generated by your crappy sound card, and there's no way for you to tell that. But that's just, when you end up pushing the limits of what the hardware can actually do, you end up with a lot of misconceptions because what you're seeing and what it's reporting to you are not what it's actually doing. So with the frame rate thing, there's, sort of a magic number around 60 where consciously or subconsciously, you're not really registering a difference anymore, and you're basically getting as much information as you can process in most situations. Again, it's a use case thing. And then a favorite thing that people like to do is push the thing and go to absolute extremes and be like, oh, well, you know, I think there's a famous test by the Air Force where they showed faster and faster silhouettes of airplanes to Air Force test people, and they found that something like 900 hertz was still identifiable, and if somebody saw a flash of a plane silhouette at 900 hertz, they could still like identify the shape of the plane. And the problem there is you get into all this weird stuff where like you're really pushing the use case against the technology itself, and then the question of like whether you're actually seeing that or what, because what we were talking about earlier about this problem is if you take the test of like black screen, flash up a light image. How fast can you make that light image before your eye can no longer perceive it? Right? You would think that that's a decent test of that, except it's a terrible test, because eventually you can push it so that the duration of the flash is immeasurable by even the best quantum mechanics gear, but if it's putting out a number of photons, your eyes are going to see those photons, because your eye doesn't have like a shutter that it's closing against. The photons are hitting your eye, and you're going to see it no matter how fast that flash was. But if you reverse that, and you have a bright image, and then you flash it dark, then you have a completely different case. And what ends up happening with all this stuff is diminishing returns. And that is like the end answer for most of these things is a question of diminishing returns. And it's just like, okay, if we waste all this time and effort and hardware and money on getting up to 1,000 frames a second, can we see it? That's not the question anymore. The question is not can we see it. The question is it worth it? Should we bother? Or should we be using this power to, you know, make better controllers or something, or do something useful with our lives? So, anyway. That is all I've got for frame rate.
Well, one last thing I'll add on frame rate before we should probably move to color.
Yeah.
Is anyone have any idea why it is important, why frame rate is more important in games than it is in film? For example, why would you want a frame rate of more than 60 frames per second for a game? Yeah.
Reaction time.
Reaction time. And lag. So if you look at the number of frames per second, that's kind of it's part of an indicator of how long it takes that signal to reach you. You make a change, you press an input, and you make a change to the game state. If you're operating at 120 hertz, that means that there's kind of, and there's a lot of buffering involved, lots of changes. There's a lot, there's a
cable though.
What's going on?
I was just looking for an HDMI cable to demo the lag.
Okay, yeah. So there's about half the amount of time before the signal reaches the processor or the graphics processor, the output, the RAM DAC, whatever, to your video. And so that you want to reduce that as much as possible, but again, there's diminishing returns, and it's just a sampling problem.
Yeah. Another thing I might just want to throw in is actually just amount of data. When you have objects moving very, very fast across the screen, like if you got any like very fast-paced FPS players, like Quake 3 back in the day or whatever, you pull like a 180-degree rail shot or something like that. It might literally only take like 3 or 4 frames to turn around, find the person's head, and hit it. And the more frames you have, the more information you have. You can use motion blur to kind of make the brain perceive it as smoother, but still getting more information in there can both, you know, help with accuracy, but also in general comfort level, especially when you're doing like these big sweeping motions, which movies don't do, which is one of the reasons why they kind of have a little lower threshold and they've been able to get away from with like 24 hertz, because you're not spinning a film camera around in like 0.2 of a second constantly throughout, you know, a movie. That's just a cut.
Okay. All right, I'm going to move on to color. Check that out. When I finally understood this, it blew my little mind. You do not see linear intensity of light. What you're looking at there is perceptually linear on the bottom. Actually, both of these are perceptually linear. You see them as linear. They're not actually linear. If you've heard of gamma, where's the other one? Oh, I didn't get another good one. But this one's good. Right here. On the right side, what you're seeing is a sphere that is lit with a linear fall off. Except it's not. The sphere on the left is actually linear, but you perceive it as mostly bright, and then there's a sharper fall off from the light side to the dark side. This is an artifact of the non-linear nature of your vision. It's an evolutionary thing. We are far more sensitive to dark images than we are to bright ones. We can see into the dark better than we can see detail in like a bright sky.
Logarithmic.
Yeah.
Same with audio.
Well, it's logarithmic or it's gamma or whatever. It's all approximation.
Kind of like the frame rates, it's like, it's not about going from 5 to 6, it's about going from 5 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 40. Like, each of those is a step, not perceived to twice as bright, but like one step up in brightness.
This is where it was. I saved it here. Yeah, okay, so that's a gamma curve. You've got a linear line and then the gamma's pushed up, gamma's pushed down. If you care, you can look this stuff up. It's graphics nerd shit. So the image that you're looking at there is tiny little black and white stripes at 1 pixel, so that when you're looking at them casually, you sort of perceive them as gray. And then a middle gray and an actual middle gray. Right here, this should be your middle gray. This is your middle gray. Where's the, here we go. And so what happens is this is how a camera encodes. They encode it too dark or too bright because what they want to do is save the darker information because the brighter information is useless to your eyes. So then you get into this confusing crap where, you know, this chart shows actual light at 1, you know, flat gamma, and then it's saved onto the hard drive as whatever, and then it gets, you know, a 0.45 gamma applied, and then a 0.2 gamma to return it, and da-da-da, and it goes on, and it turns into a giant mess, and it should be confusing because it's a clusterfuck. And basically, computers have only really had the ability to do something decent about this very recently. Because...
Past 10 years-ish.
Yeah. Because they just didn't have enough processing power to work with everything in a linear space and then present it to you in a nonlinear space. So basically in the digital world, everything is linear, but your eyes are perceiving things non-linearly. You're seeing the dark parts better. And the computer compensating for that is the source of a whole shitload of subtle little problems that you don't understand consciously until you study them for a couple of years and, you know, get into color science and all this crazy shit. If anybody's more interested in that, or I didn't make sense, look up nonlinear color and, you know, gamma curves and stuff like that and study it up. It took me a long time to really, really get it and have it click as to, like, what the computer was actually doing with that information, so it's a little confusing.
I'll actually, just one little thing. You might have heard a scale called the decibel scale for audio. It's very similar, it's very similar to kind of the eye, but the deal with the decibel scale, it's like a measure of loudness, or sound pressure, really, which is kind of the same but kind of different. Whereas 6 decibels is a doubling of energy, so a doubling of actual sound pressure. No, actually it's 3. 3 decibels is a doubling of sound pressure, so that's a doubling of energy. But you don't perceive a doubling of volume until you've gone 10 decibels. So the difference between like 30 and 33 decibels is not, is a lot. The difference between like 90 and 93 decibels, I'll shut up now. But anyway,
the Richter scale
it's similar.
Josh, do you know what you're talking about? Where's your degree?
He's got enough degrees for the three of us.
Yeah.
So then, I'm not going to hang around on the linear thing for too long. Does anybody here not know what I'm talking about when I say RGB? Okay.
All right, one thing before we jump into
Okay.
this, I used to, I taught a bunch of things. I used to teach at Duke TIP, which is it's a program for teaching kids kind of advanced stuff. I wrote on the board a whole bunch of different scales, RGB, CMYK, red, blue, yellow, the traditional one from that you learn in art school. CIE, the color scale, a whole bunch of these different things. I asked, okay, who here thinks that, which of these are primary colors? And I asked, show of hands, and these are like very, very gifted and talented, like 10th graders or so. And everybody thought that red, green, and blue, red, yellow, blue was the most popular one. These are the primary ones, this is what we learned. Turns out that everything except that could technically be considered primary colors. The entire reason that yellow, red, and blue is used as a primary colors in art is because cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, well, cyan and magenta were too expensive through the Renaissance. And so artists made do with red and yellow. Or red and blue, I mean.
So everybody's heard the Roy G. Biv mnemonic for rainbows? It's bullshit. Somebody pulled it out of their ass like 200 years ago and it stuck. That is literally it. It has nothing to do with anything.
Wasn't there some pressure to match the musical scale for that one?
I haven't
very well
heard that. I believe you though. That sounds plausible. But basically it has no basis in anything. Like it's just like somebody decided this is how we're dividing up the rainbow, and then like they've been teaching it to kids for like 200 years. The image that I brought up here is the best illustration I could find of a phenomenon that I was not totally aware of until recently. Everybody knows that like monitors and stuff are RGB, red, green, and blue. And then printing is CMYK, it's cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And when you learn about eyes, you learn that you have these cones, and you have, like they're showing you here, a blue cone, a green cone, and a red cone that corresponds to like, what your monitor is showing you. But if you look right here, you'll see that the red cone isn't perceiving red at all. It really should be called the yellow cone. The green cone is like right next to it and isn't really perceiving green, it's perceiving this funky yellow-green here. The blue cone kind of sits where it's supposed to according to, the names or whatever. But the other thing that you'll notice is these are not nice even intervals across the visible spectrum. We've got wavelength numbers here, and what you're seeing down here is basically linear progression. You've got 400, 500, 600, 700 nanometers of wavelength of that light. And our cones are not distributed nice and rigidly across this progression of wavelengths. And the thing that this chart is not showing you is the sensitivity of these different cones is all out of whack.
Basically, it varies person to person a little bit.
The green cone is way more sensitive than the blue cones, and the distribution of them on your retina is completely different, and the sensitivity of the various ones are completely different.
And if you're a female with color blindness in your family, you may have a fourth cone, tetrachromates, and the best way to tell is if you look at a screen and you look at grass, if the grass looks wrong, you might have a fourth cone.
There are human, mostly females, with four, and the...
Or if you have the film removed from your eyes, our retinas can actually perceive UV to some degree.
Yeah, that's a good one.
But the front of your eye, the lens, filters all that out. So there's some people who've had, I forget which
lens transplants.
Lens transplants, yeah. That it doesn't filter the UV anymore, and everything looks like it's also lit by black light.
Yeah. Like just humans who have had their lens replaced, and it's not filtering just a little bit into the UV range, and to them the world looks like it's all being lit by black light all the time.
How do they get eyes like British?
Have your lenses replaced.
Well, you gotta go to prison where you don't see daylight.
So, so I mean, you're getting the point here that like these things are not arranged nicely. But all of our technical solutions are arranged fairly rigidly. Like RGB and CMY fall at pretty even intervals on this spectrum. And again, the machines are far more linear than we are. And so
red, green, and blue, what it does is that you're adding the colors together. So you're trying to push on the rod, or you're pushing on the light in each of those different spaces, very, very, very tight, like a laser, basically. Versus if you're using paint, you're kind of blending them together and it's removing. So this paint reflects this paint reflects that, and so you're blending those together, so it's going to reflect some distribution across the mixture.
Yeah, and like what you actually see, the colors that you actually see in the world, or what you're getting out of them, is this, you know, if you look at this, like these are some nice, wide, smooth bumps for these frequencies. And what it is these cones perceive everything in that range with, you know, varying strengths and all that. But when you see a light, like the light that's coming out of these guys, as you go along the wavelength, if you graph what the light is actually putting out as far as color, the graph is just a mess. It's like that, and then there's like a drop in it, and a huge spike in it, and something else. And video and film guys find this very important, and they have things called color rendering indexes and things like that, where like, there are certain lights that just will not put out a particular color. So if you're filming and you're using this light and it's putting out a bunch of yellow and a bunch of red, it looks good, it'll look good to your eye, but it's just not putting out a particular frequency of blue, and somebody's wearing a blue shirt that is just like sliding up against that frequency, then it looks all wrong on those lights.
If anyone was at MAGFest last night, anyone who was wearing blue looked like they were wearing green.
Yep. And that's just, I mean, that's an extreme case that makes it very obvious, but my point here is, in the more subtle cases, it's around you all the time. These lights, and they've got, it looks like two different kinds of lights here for the center chandeliers and the little sconces, and I might be wrong, but they put out some wacky combination of frequencies that is just all over the place and comes out as like white, kinda. And if you get into like issues of color temperature and like white balance on cameras and all that kind of stuff, you will eventually find that there is no such thing as white. White is a myth.
Pink.
The man is not.
The white
Pink is the only truth.
Yeah.
It's the real color.
Is this minus green?
So this actually segues into, there's a few artifacts you can create with your own vision. Let's see, which tab is this? You can fool your vision in a few weird ways, and Paul just lost my tab before. This one. Now, if you stimulate both of these, I don't know if you'll be able to do it from afar, but if you stare at this in such a way, you have to move the distance, you probably can't do it, such that the crosses overlap. Some people, I'm mentioning many people, your brain will receive yellow in one eye and blue in the other, and the way it will cross those is you'll perceive a color that is not really real. There's no way, you will not see it any other way except by crossing those signals. It's like a yellow-blue, and it does not exist. It's really cool. Just go try that out on your own sometime. Hold your screen up pretty close, get it just right. And it's by overstimulating some of the different... What's right here?
You're touching these buttons.
Oh, I see.
They're annoying.
I see. It's by stimulating and having after images. Now imagine that you have some sort of production. Imagine you have I don't know, some game, a resource producer, and you have some sort of... you refresh, like you ran into this resource, now you get some more. You ran into this resource, you get some more. That's how our cones and rods work. They're always atrophying. If you stare at something long enough, you know, you stare at an image, and then you look at a white screen, you'll get that after image, because those are not functioning anymore. It's like, whoa, we need time.
It's like temporary burn-in.
Yeah, it's like my arm is tired. Give me a second before I can pull it up again, so you'll get that after image. And so by, you know, we're always looking around all the time, and we're getting information in different parts of the cone, so we don't notice the burnout as much unless we do these specific edge cases. But here, it's
and if you notice, from what I was saying over here, those are like pretty nicely aligned with the blue cone and the red cone, which is actually yellow, which means that they're sort of starving out the green cone. Yeah.
Is it neurologically based? You said the fatigue, the burning. Is it neurological or is it in the eye? Like is it habituation or?
No, I believe actually. I believe it is actually, well, your neurons have to take a little bit of time again before they fire. They fire and like, okay, they need to kind of reconstruct some things, get ready to fire again. And if you look at some of those videos of how cells work, they really have, it's amazing all the things they have to do to reprime themselves. It's like You have cannons, and they have to do all this work to shove the cannonball, they shove the powder, the primer, all that stuff in there, the cannonball, and then they fire it again. And that's really how it works. We perceive it as continuous because our mind is filling in all these gaps, but really it's very discrete.
All right, we don't have a hell of a lot of time left, but I'll just keep talking until Tim comes to kick us out or something. This is a neat one that jumps over into resolution, which we haven't really touched yet, kinda, which is really about bandwidth. The idea is just stare at the green dot. If you just keep looking at the green dot, and it should only take about 5 seconds, the yellow dots start to disappear. And this one should not be too tricky. Like, all of you guys should be able to see this. It's called motion-induced blindness. And if you just have particular types of consistent motion, your brain quits processing things properly. And it's just like, okay, that is no longer relevant information. I don't care, I'm not gonna look at that. And you keep staring at that for a while, and you'll see those yellow dots sort of come in and out of your perception, like, randomly.
There are 4 lights.
Is that where you can see the wiring on the inside of your eye, basically?
Well, that is more of a, like, your brain is just always filling in data. Okay, does everybody know about the blind spot that you have? Like, you look a few degrees off of your focal point, and where your optic nerve is it to the inside or the outside?
Well, the nerve's to the inside, so on the image it's on the outside.
Right, okay, so if you just if you look at your finger, and then keep looking where you're looking, and move your finger like that, somewhere around there, your finger will disappear, and you won't be able to perceive it anymore.
It's better with a point like at night with the moon is a really good test. If you look up at like the moon with one eye, like with your right eye particularly, and then you look like a few inches to the left, or just slowly start looking to the left, the moon will just disappear, because where all of the nerve bundle on the back of your retina, where everything like goes in, there's actually a blind spot where you don't have any cones or rods, and you're just completely blind.
I can't see this finger right now.
And like Photoshop, your brain just sort of fills in the image.
Can you see this one? So what's up there is your optic nerve is off of the focal center of your eye, and where your optic nerve collects all the nerves, there's no sensors. All the rods and cones just go away in that little spot, and you can't actually sense anything. You're completely blind on that spot where the optic nerve comes off in the back of your eye. And you don't notice it. I mean, has anybody ever consciously noticed that there's just like a spot over here that they can't see?
The brain just fills in a lot of things. If you look, there's a few images online that show you what the eye is actually perceiving, what light is coming in there, and what is being projected on the retina. It is horrible. It's low resolution. It's blurry. The focal point is very tiny, but our brain is filling in all the details. We look here, we look there, we look there. The brain says, "Oh, I remember all of this." I'm going to code it as it were.
Oh,
I could add. No, the thing that you talked about before about the
saccades.
Yeah, the saccades. Yeah.
Well, okay, I'll talk about the saccades, and I also want to put...
the short term.
Here's just a little a mind blow kind of thing. So a saccade is it's the term for an eye movement, like a conscious eye movement. So like if I look from you to you, you know, your eye makes one discrete movement. What the eye does is it picks a target and it tracks and it locks on and it holds. You can't like smoothly look across the room. Your eye will do all of these individual discrete movements. And those are referred to as saccades. Now, from the perspective of the person moving their eye, those movements are instantaneous. You don't notice any like blurring, any sliding from your eye to from place one to place two. It is as far as you can perceive instant. But if you watch somebody else do it, you can actually see their eye. It's not that their eyes move so fast that our brains can't perceive them. You can watch somebody's eyes move around. And what actually happens is when your eye reaches the new destination and locks in, all the image data from position 1 to position 2 is complete garbage. It's just a blurred out mess. You're not getting enough information for long enough to make useful information, so it would be disorienting. So the brain discards all of that information. Once you lock onto the new target and get a decent image, it goes essentially back in time and rewrites your memory of the event with the new image. So it doesn't like hold the old one longer until you've got the new one. It actually takes the new one and writes it back in your memory. So if you've ever looked at an analog clock like back in school with the second hand ticking and ever like glanced at it, and like the moment that you look at it, it looks like the second that it is on right then hangs a little longer than a second before moving again. That's what is happening there. You're actually perceiving that second as lasting longer than a second because your memory of it goes before it actually happened. So there you go.
Does that link to saccadic masking? I mean, the idea of, opening your eye, your brain, is that like...
It's related to the saccades, but not necessarily the temporal. You're talking about like resolution, like dynamic resolution rendering kind of stuff, or there's just a thing with. Well, I won't really get into that, but people are doing studies. We're doing eye tracking where you only render high resolution where somebody is looking, and you render low resolution everywhere else. And it fits in because you would think that there's a delay in the electronics to detect the motion of your eye, and so every time you move your eye around, you would have some artifacting because the computer wouldn't be able to move the focus point as fast enough. But the actual truth is that the computer has all kinds of time to move the focus point because it's going to move it, and then your brain is going to erase any of the artifacts from your memory anyway. So it's actually an easier problem to solve than you might think.
And to just add to that a little bit, you're kind of operating in the past already. Think about you touch something, you pick it up. It takes a time for the signal to propagate up through your arm to your brain, and it takes time for your brain to analyze it. And that delay can be quite considerable. When you make a decision or you perform some sort of action, there's just a small spattering of neurons that get activated when you do that, and after you've made a decision, that's when all your brain lights up. So it's almost like it's setting all these mice traps to make all these different decisions, and then you act on it. So we could be operating as far back as a quarter of a second in the past.
And like your brain is literally rewriting your memory of the past to make it sound like it's all happening in real time.
Yes.
But also colors.
So yeah, and we haven't touched on resolution really, but we've orbited around the issue. Interesting fact, and I say fact a little loosely because I don't know what I'm talking about. You guys can look it up if you really give a shit. Essentially, HD TV, like our standard like 1080p, 60 frames a second, whatever, is pushing more data than our optic nerve. And it's just about the distribution of data. And the question of resolution is yet another issue of the computer is linear and we are not. Where we focus, and this one's obvious to anybody, everybody knows this, where we focus, you've got a lot more resolution, you can see a lot more detail, and out here in your peripheral vision, it just goes to mush.
That's what he just said.
But a monitor...
I was talking about computers mimicking that so that you could actually render higher quality looking image.
The next step of correction of that, and like a monitor just has a linear grid on it. It's just a number of pixels by a number of pixels, and wherever you're looking at, it's got the same pixel density, which means like 80% of the pixels on your monitor are completely wasted at any given moment, because the ones that you're not looking directly at, you can't really see. They're mush. They might as well be like 1/10 of the resolution.
Isn't the fact that the TV that is so much more efficient, is there a delay between what your eyes see and what you process?
Right, and again, it's like a use case scenario and diminishing returns again, whatever, and like what you can actually perceive at your focal point is incredibly detailed, and like Apple released their retina displays and their idea was like it matches the human retina or whatever, which is nonsense. The human retina is not linear, it's not extremely quantifiable, you can't like designate a resolution that matches the human retina, it's complete bullshit. But you have such detail in the focal point that to get to that point, we would still have to like quadruple the resolution of the best displays that we're working with on a normal basis to really get to that point where we were matching the resolution of what your eye is picking up. But to quadruple the resolution of the spot that your eye is looking at, you have to quadruple the resolution of the entire freaking screen, and man, that's a lot of data. Like, and a lot of tiny, tiny little transistors somebody has to manufacture.
Well, not only that, but got all of that, where you're focused, because the idea is to draw the attention usually to one specific thing on the screen that's happening, you might get overwhelmed, or we already have people that get motion sick.
Yeah, well, I mean, your brain eliminates that so you don't get overwhelmed. All right, headband dude here.
So we've already covered the lower limits of what colors we can distinguish, but I don't think we ever talked about the upper limits of what human eye can perceive color. Like, how many different colors?
Do you know about the mantis shrimp?
Yes, and how many different season, Yashar, rainbow, and a bunch of things today.
Yeah, yeah,
Whole bunch of them,
Yes.
yeah.
lots of colors.
It also depends on, remember I mentioned before, we looked at those curves, and I said it's different depending on the person. Depending on where your curves fall off, you might be able to perceive a better gradient in this part of red than somebody else. And so if you want to see the maximum number of colors that you should have in a display, you really have to look across the entire distribution of people and maximize it for all of them.
A lot of it is contextual too, because of the sort of linear nature. The linear nature of it, like, you might be able to perceive the step between this one color and this one color in a very tightly controlled environment, but then when you put it in the middle of an image, you wouldn't. So,
You ever seen one?
oh yeah, that's tricky. First, I wanted to head these up for a while there.
Is it possible to have a screen that has a camera on it that tracks where your eyes are?
Well, yeah, that's what I was just talking about a little bit earlier. They're starting to do that in order to try to start push graphics that are higher and higher fidelity, because it's not practical to keep quadrupling the amount of power that we need to render, is to actually, like if you had a 4K monitor and you had an eye tracker that watched where you were tracking, it could render very high detail where you're looking and just blur everything else out. And that's where the saccades come into play, which is, since your brain is constantly rewiring or rewriting your memory of the past, like the computer has the time of an eye movement to make that track, find a location, put the high resolution rendering there. It's like a 1/10 of a second or something like that. It's a pretty decent chunk of time. So they were finding that like it's actually not that hard to do, because it seems like your eyes are moving instantaneously, but they're totally not.
So, all right, on the color question, I just literally like searched for color perception test, and this is the first hit. It's a thing where you can just grab these little blocks and arrange them in order of, try and make a nice, smooth, linear gradient out of them. And they're so subtle that and this is, again, what I was talking about the limitations of the hardware causing artifacts. What I'm seeing on my screen right here is very different color-wise from what's showing up here. And across displays, like CRTs versus plasma versus LCDs versus DLP displays, etc., and the quality of the display and whatever, their color rendering is all over the place, just really all over the place. And I mean, you can see that when you walk into a Best Buy and look at a wall of screens, and the color calibration is all over the place, even though they're pretty much the same damn LCD over and over again. So it's pretty hard to sort of test this stuff. And I don't know enough about the science or the numbers when it comes to color perception, but this little test right here is the best thing I got. And I do know that, people talk about color blindness. Color blindness is one of those things that's on a very wide scale, and there's a lot of different forms of it, and everybody perceives color very slightly differently. Everybody is just marginally, 2% colorblind versus somebody else on something else. So it's basically an impossible thing to nail down. There's no easy answer to a question about color perception.
So if that's true, is it true that artists can perceive more colors or more grade to grade than
Artists?
other people?
Well, artists can only actually see about 25 frames per second.
I meant through training, because they work with colors on a consistent basis.
Well, okay, you can definitely train your eyes. I see a whole shitload of things that most people don't see. You have no idea. The best example is if you've ever seen Fight Club, there's a scene where he points out what they call the cigarette burn in the thing. And I knew about that before Fight Club came out, and when he started explaining it, I was like, oh, yeah, now everybody's going to see this. There's also forget what the real acronym is, but they just call it the crap code. It's like the copy protection action something or other code. There's a copy protection thing that came up in movies like 10 years ago when, you know, peer-to-peer distribution became a problem. And every print of a film goes out with a unique identifier on it, and they take the form of a little code that is just a single frame blip, and it looks kind of like a Braille character. Like if you know what Braille looks like, it's just sort of a little series of dots. They'll just be like one Braille character in the middle of a single frame of film somewhere. And the idea is it's like, it's not consciously noticeable, but if a pirated copy of a film gets out, then they can go through and look for these codes and identify essentially the serial number of that film, and then they figure out which theater leaked that. That was the idea.
That's why you shouldn't pirate movies.
Yeah. So the problem is, if you look into this stuff, and you look for an example, and you see what it looks like, then you see it. Then you see it everywhere. And you won't consciously notice it until you know what it looks like, and then you're sitting in the middle of a glorious movie, and Galadriel in slow motion is glowing with her light of the world and telling Frodo that, boom, she's got a zit on her forehead.
At 48 frames per second.
Yeah, no, that was 24. 24 is way too long for that to be subconscious once you know what you're looking for. And like I said, I've worked in, you know, visual effects and games and everything, and I have trained myself to see all the artifacts, which kind of sucks because images look like crap to me. And, you know, back in the NTSC days when you had like composite versus component video or whatever, I could just look at the screen and be like, oh, that's S-video. Because I can spot the color artifacting and the dot crawls and everything. And like, I forget all of it now, thankfully. NTSC is over. But yeah, I mean, when you work with this stuff anymore, you'll notice particular types of compression artifacts and all kinds of things like just by looking at them.
Just a funny little historical anecdote, there were backronyms for NTSC and PAL, pretty awful looking and never twice the same color.
Yeah, because color calibration with NTSC is pretty much impossible. There's a dude in the back there. Yep.
This is kind of an arbitrary question.
I love those.
Twilight Golden Lake Ride 2013 came, it was announced. There was a big stink, one of about 100, towards the developers about the fact that the game was in 30 frames per second for the console. Their reasoning was that the average person actually couldn't discern between 30 and 60 frames.
They're lying. That's marketing biz where we can't get it to run in 60 frames per second.
And the problem is, again, it goes to my magic number thing. The threshold around 30 is where you stop being able to consciously tell the difference unless you have a worst case scenario to look at. If you have like an A-B comparison, you can just be like, oh yeah, that looks less choppy. But if you don't have a situation like that, you're not really going to consciously notice the difference between 30 and 60 frames per second, depending on what it is that you're looking at, but you will subconsciously notice it. What your brain processes and everything, and what you really get from it is definitely different.
And when making a game, you want to ensure a fairly smooth set of frames per second. You don't want it to be 60 frames per second here, and then you drop down to 15 when you're looking at a very rich, long scene. Games used to be like that before the algorithms got better, before a lot of game developers got focused on the worst case. So when they're saying we're going to target 30 frames per second, they're really doing that. And let's say some art assets, some rendering, some function post-processing that they're using takes a certain amount of time, they're budgeting towards the worst case. So if they say, we need the game to look like this, and they can't pull off the 60 frames per second, because 40% of the time they're still at like 48 frames per second, and then 10% of the time they drop below 29 frames per second, they just say, all right, we're just going to cut it at 30, and we're going to put some marketing fluff around it.
All right, I have an interesting story that I have to get out before we get booted out. By the way, did Tim say anything about when we...
Yeah, he said that.
Oh, is there anybody following us?
Not near.
Oh, okay, all right, this panel's going to go on for another hour.
Please bring us food. I'm kidding.
No, but real quick, the phenomenon of input lag. I would like to make everybody aware of this who is not. They call it input lag mostly. There's a couple other names for it.
Who is not?
Does anybody here know what input lag is? Okay, all right. That's that's about what I figured. So everybody knows what like pixel lag is. Like when you're looking at an LCD and they list specs and it's like 12 millisecond gray to gray, whatever, and that's the refresh rate of the pixels. What happened with the technology is in order to get the pixel refresh faster, they've done pre-processing to the image that incurs a different delay. Because if you're going to process something temporally based on frames, you need the next frame to have information about what you're going to do to the current frame. So you have to wait for the next frame to come in, process the frames accordingly, and then spit it out. Now if you're watching a movie or something, the only issue is if you press pause on your Blu-ray player, you're going to have to wait 1/10 of a second for that thing to pause. Great. But when you're playing a video game, 1/10 of a second is forever. Oh my God, that can change everything. And we have an interesting thing that I would love to test that happened at MAGFest. If anybody knows about the challenges booth downstairs in the game room, you can do old school like NES and Genesis games with challenges that are set up where like you have to beat the final boss of Mega Man with only 1 bar of health or something like that. And the challenge, like there's been hundreds of these things over the years, and the challenge that never went down was beating Mike Tyson in the first round. And my theory on why this is because we're emulating it on laptops. And the amount of lag in the LCD screen on the laptop, input lag and total lag in general, is just enough to make that almost impossible. Because what Mike Tyson is a pure reaction time game. And I did studies on this, like myself, with my game company, like 20 years ago on the Saturn. We made a thing that we called reaction games. It was like we were testing the Saturn libraries, and the first game we made was just reaction games. And it would just put up a blank screen and then say go, and you push the button. And then it would report how many frames it took for you to push the button. And we discovered that human reaction time is about 1/5 of a second. It's about 12 frames, which is like 200 milliseconds. Period. You cannot go any faster than that. Just your neurons just do not react faster than that no matter what you do.
Varies from person to person, of course, but like...
Only slightly.
Yeah.
Only very slightly. It varies from like 12 frames to 14 frames. That's it. Like you get you get your grandmother and hand her the controller, she'll be able to do that sucker in like 15 frames. And then you get like the fastest gamer ever, and every once in a while they'll get 11 frames. They'll never get under 10. So Mike Tyson just blinks before he's going to punch you. And the time between the blink and the punch is so tight with human reaction time that a 1 frame lag will make it impossible to react. And it took like our best challenges guy who had beaten every single challenge we had, it took him 3 years to beat that in our challenges. And I really want to set him up with an actual NES and a CRT and see how hard it is, because I've beaten Mike Tyson in the first round before. It's not that hard. It shouldn't be that hard. But I think the like 1 or 2 frames of lag that he had on the laptop made it impossible. Anyway.
First of all, thank you for that story. That was actually very exciting. And it's actually, this is kind of like a follow-up question to someone made a comment where some parts of the game will operate at a lower frame rate because
right. And by the way, on the Mike Tyson thing, if you play any of the retro systems, you play old school, you know, Mario, Sonic, etc. They're all they're all running at 60 hertz. Like all those games are running at 60 frames a second. And that was something that we just took for granted back then, and you have shit like the original Ninja Gaiden that's like the hardest freaking reaction and timing game ever made. And the intensity of the timing that Ninja Gaiden demands is only possible because it's running at 60 hertz. Like at 30 hertz, you just would not be able to do some of the shit that Ninja Gaiden requires.
Did it ever make it? I mean, what was the average FPS that the NES could allow? Was it 60?
It was just like that. The NES is locked to your TV. It's using your TV as a synchronization signal, and it just puts out 60 frames. And like the way it would artifact is sprites would disappear. Rather than frame rate slowing down, you'd lose sprites. And so if you ever saw, like, when you get a couple of sprites on a line and they start flickering,
everything old is new again. The temporal, the adaptive frameless rendering I was showing you is kind of what the AMS was doing, kind of. Yeah.
Because wouldn't it show like multiple times throughout that line, or they flicker on and off?
Well, then we get into the interlacing thing, and basically what's up and why nobody ever really noticed it or whatever is the resolution of those old systems is so low that it doesn't flicker on the interlacing. Like, it's showing the same thing on each scan line, so you don't see that interlace flicker.
I think more to kind of address what you were talking about, and is like with the 30 versus 60 on the modern stuff, and they're saying, well, we're going to target 30 because most people can only see 30 or whatever. Like what Chris was saying earlier, often a more consistent frame rate is better than a frame rate that can, so if you're rendering between 30 and 60.
Consistent is better than faster.
Yeah, yeah. So if you're rendering between 30 and 60, a lot of times they will limit it to 30 and really target 30 if they can't pull off 60. And at that point, it'll just hold it at 30 and prevent the game engine from going over. Even if there's some points where it could easily do 60 at this point, but then your brain will get used to 60, and when it drops down again, suddenly, wow, artifacting.
In case you don't remember, that's all changing right now. G-Sync.
Well, kind of, yeah, yeah. People actually.
Yeah. For the people who aren't aware, NVIDIA just introduced a new thing where they've gotten together with the screen manufacturers.
Kind of the same, kind of different though. Because that just affects the tearing, but still.
Yeah, no, but it's very relevant. It's the same issue. It's just a solution to that issue, kind of.
Even with G-Sync, if you were running 60 and then it dropped to 30, it would still be.
I haven't seen it myself.
Yeah,
so
okay, so there's two things here. One is the tearing and the synchronization between the GPU and, well, actually the GPU RAM. Well, I forget if they use RAM DACs, separate RAM DACs anymore. But anyway, between that and
the digital, so RAM DAC.
Right, but there's I think there's a separate processor that sort of shovels that data out. So it's not a RAM DAC anymore, but it's something else there. But anyway, there's that process, and there's also the rendering. So imagine that you're looking over this beautiful 2-mile-long field of vision. You're looking over the entire. You're standing on top of a mountain, looking at the entire game world, and the algorithm that figures out what to display, all the octree algorithms, all the collision, the spatial indexing, it has to process a lot more. So even though the GPU is still in sync with the monitor and there's some lag there's the amount of content that you're rendering.
When is that?
Game developers try to make sure that there's level of detail, LOD, that if the further away something is, the fewer polygons, you drop down the shaders, you make everything simpler so you don't need to spend as much time rendering that. If you've got a person who's at, I don't know, a half mile away, let's just render them as a single sprite, a couple little dots. Nobody's going to care 2 polygons. But if you're up close to that person, you might want to use the full 10,000 polygon model. And, but because you're doing all those sort of things, you try to keep a smooth frame rate, but sometimes you end up with cases that are just computationally intensive. Or let's say that, like for example, EVE Online, we were talking about that in a previous panel, when you have 10,000 ships all on the screen at the same time, so there's so many game mechanics to compute, it just slows everything down. And so the game developer has to look at the worst possible case and then gear it around that.
Well, first of all, the frame rates was in that particular, or rather the follow-up question, to be specific, is that if you look at Team Ninja's most recent games, specifically Ninja 3 and Devil May 5, there are I guess the core game itself is at 60 frames, but the cutscenes are at 30 frames. So I'm wondering what made the developer do something like that.
Well, that just means they can make the cutscenes prettier by just rendering more detail. Since the player is not interacting with them, the temporal data isn't as critical, and it's sort of a sharp cut from one to the next. So, you know, the sort of disorientation of going from high frame rate to low frame rate is kind of covered up by the fact that your context changes also. So they can get away with dropping to 30 frames per second for the cutscenes, which allows them to make the cutscenes really rich and pretty. If they had the horsepower to do the cutscenes at 60, they absolutely would. There's no reason that they wouldn't. But if they had the horsepower to do the cutscenes at 60, they would probably just increase the overall level of detail so that, you see what I'm saying? Like, they're just making
It's a general diminishing returns and like engineering question thing, and this is one of those cases where I see people arguing about dumb fanboy shit a lot, and it sets off my rants. where like there's a game and somebody finds out this is not actually rendering at 1080p. They're upscaling it from 800 scan lines. They're cheating. Class action lawsuit. This is not truly HD, and it says HD on the box. All this absurd shit. And if you throw away some of the GPU power you were using to get that resolution, and use some of that power to get more frame rate, or to make your shaders look a little bit better, or whatever, it's worth far more than those extra couple of scan lines that you really are not going to notice the difference between. And like, that's one of those things, like, if anybody ever tells you they can tell the difference between 24 and 30 frames per second, they're full of shit. You can, in a worst case, side-by-side A/B comparison, and you can, because of a lot of artifacts, like if you can see that like film has been converted to video, it's because if you're forcing 24 frames onto 30 frames and things happen because of that.
Back with sampling again.
But if you legitimately just have identical displays, one clocked at 30 and one clocked at 24, and they are otherwise identical, if you don't do like an immediate A/B comparison, there's no way in hell you're going to be able to actually tell the difference between which one is running 6 frames per second faster.
I work in video production.
Okay.
So we've actually done a bunch of 24 to 30 frames tests.
Yeah.
And one of the things that bothers me is if we've had to film something in 30, because we have a screen or something.
3-2 pull down and everything is a nightmare.
But the display on the back of the camera, one of the big things is like you can actually notice if you've spent years and years and years and years looking at the difference between 24 and 30. I don't think you necessarily need the A/B comparison, because if I turn on that camera and it's running at 30 frames a second, even if it doesn't have a 30 frames per second indicator, I know it's at 30 frames a second.
Now, all right, my question
is based on conditioning.
Right, my question is, do you know for certain, like empirically, mechanically, do you know that that screen is actually syncing to the 2 different rates, and you're not seeing like a 30 frames per second screen that's giving you 24 and doing some kind of frame judder to display it?
No, I don't.
Right, because you can spot frame judder easily. Sure. You can spot 3-2 pull down a mile away. But I have never actually personally seen the test that I'm talking about. I've never actually seen in action, because I don't know of a device that will actually just arbitrarily sync to these different things without introducing some kind of artifact. I mean, you can probably do it with a PC screen under some circumstances, but then I've never actually done that, so.
I know that the camera turns off the display and then turns it back on, so my assumption was always that it was resyncing.
It's resyncing, right, yeah.
Actually, an interesting, I'm just curious, I'm wondering if you, let's say a 120 hertz display, if you deliberately slowed it down. Yeah, if you deliberately slowed it down and rendered at 24 frames per second and 30 frames per second, if you'd be able to emulate that, basically.
On 100, right, yeah, like on a way overdriven display. Yeah, I'm curious about that too. So, I want to talk about the perception of acoustic guitars, which is going on in the main concert hall right now, which I'm about 10 minutes late for. The Super Guitar Brothers are playing right now.
Oh, right, okay.
So, I have a reason to end this panel. Thank you. And if anyone wants to babble with me and Chris about whatever, including these topics, I have a bullshit panel at about 2 a.m. where I'm just going to be sitting over that room talking to whoever about whatever. So, show up, say hi, hang out.